Chapter 9. Should the church be about the business of taking care of poor people, and what does a character named blind Bartimaeus have to do with this discussion? I want to start out here by reading a simple text, Deuteronomy chapter 15, for there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, to the poor in your land. I'm convinced that Jesus was paraphrasing this text when he said, the poor you will always have with you. This chapter is about the balance between the principle of human compassion and the principle of human responsibility. It's a hard call to make, and I've missed it on both sides. Sometimes I've found myself being a little too hard on someone, and other times being a little too soft. And in case you're wondering, when pastors get together, they actually talk about this a lot because it's something that we all struggle with. You know, what would Jesus do? And how much financial help should you give someone who is constantly broke and refuses to address his or her core issues? Now, I've gotten played many times in ministry by people stopping by and wanting me to write them a check with no strings attached. And I've learned that when people are desperate, they justify dishonesty without a second thought. They will lie about why they're broke. They will lie about what they're doing to fix their issues. They will lie about their circumstances. And one of the litmus tests that I've learned to use is if this person is trying to use any type of guilt or manipulation on me to get a freebie out of me, see, someone who is honestly trying to fix their problems will not do that to you, but a con man will. And one of the questions also that I ask them is, where do you go to church? Because if they had a church, they wouldn't be standing here talking to me. And what I really want them to see in that moment is, if the church is pointless, then why are you here asking us for money? And I'm simply trying to get them to see the big picture. You know, maybe you need to change a lifestyle. Maybe you need a network of people around you. Think about where you're going in life and who you're giving your heart to. Now, I know we're all called to care, but we're also called to be good stewards of the money and the resources that people entrust us with. And when I hand someone a check or a voucher from my church, I see the faces of the people in my church who worked hard and gave sacrificially for me to be able to do that. And I feel like that's the least that I owe them. Now, you know, we always quote these verses in the Bible about helping the poor, but what is the biblical definition of a poor person? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are two different words that are translated poor in the New Testament, and one of them is the word penes, spelled P-E-N-E-S, and it was used to indicate what we would call a poor commoner who worked hard but didn't have a lot of material possessions, probably did not own a piece of land, etc., okay? That word is only used one time in the New Testament, and so it's kind of irrelevant to our point. But the word poor that is commonly translated 99.9% of the time is the word patokos. And it's a word in the Greek language that's used to indicate the biblical definition of what a poor person really is. And the word patokos, literally translated, means a cringing beggar. It can also mean to bend or to fold over. It's referencing or trying to describe someone who crawls around and begs for anything that they can get. Now, this would indicate someone who either has a serious physical deformity or an injury that rendered them from physically being incapable of doing a day's work. We do not have a lot of beggars in America. Those people qualify for a lot of government assistance and government disability. What we do have in America is we have a lot of loafers. And there's a huge difference between what I would consider a beggar and a bum, okay? Now, a true beggar has no way out of the situation, no matter how hard they try. There's just too many obstacles in the way. They are either physically or mentally incapable of making it on their own. I'm okay with the church and the government stepping in at that point and helping these kind of people out. And I also believe that one of the reasons God has blessed this great nation is because we take care of people who cannot take care of themselves. But a loafer, a bum, is someone who has just simply chosen to live an irresponsible life. He's chosen to disconnect from society because it's easier than getting up and going to work every day. He doesn't care that everyone around him has to pull that much harder because he's not pulling at all. He's lazy. He doesn't care. We all know that guy, okay? I want to enter into a story here, a 2,000-year-old story, about a guy named blind Bartimaeus, and let me just say something. We could learn something from ancient Rome here. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus enters Jericho with his disciples, and there sits a poor, blind man begging for whatever he can get. And when he hears Jesus is coming, and I quote, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus says, "Tell him to come here." Now listen to this next phrase. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumps to his feet and comes to Jesus. Now, why is that little statement there in the Bible, throwing his cloak aside? This cloak that Mark was referring to here was a cloak the Roman government called a beggar's cloak. It was standard issue to people who they knew were legitimately disabled, and you didn't get a beggar's cloak because you were depressed or had a numbing sensation in the left leg or addicted to alcohol or anything else. You had to have an obvious physical deformity or an injury that disqualified you from being able to do a day's work, and that's when you were issued a beggar's cloak. Now, if you got caught faking it, you were in some serious trouble because you were taking resources from someone who really needed them. Now, when Bartimaeus tossed his cloak aside, literally what he was doing is he was abandoning his legal right to beg in the Roman Empire. You see, this was his security blanket. When this guy threw this cloak aside, he walked away from the only income stream that he had. That's a great reason to start crying, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And one of the things I think it's hard for us to understand in the modern era is that when this text was written, 99.9% of all jobs were physical labor. And if you had a physical handicap that prevented you from working, well, then either your family took care of you or you were reduced to a beggar's life. You see, I have friends who have physical challenges. I have a few friends that are blind. They work a variety of jobs. But there were no jobs like that back then for blind people. And this cloak that he threw aside, when he did this, he knew for a fact that this was the only chance that he might ever have to start life over with two brand new eyes. And when you really think about it too, when his eyes turned on, the first face he ever saw was the face of Jesus. What a deal, right? Now, this is the verse that people always cite about helping, quote, poor people. It's Matthew 19:21. It's where Jesus is speaking to a rich young ruler, and he tells him, "Go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me," okay? What it actually says in the original Greek language is go sell your possessions and give to the patokos, okay? Sell your possessions and give to the patokos, meaning someone who is physically or mentally incapable of doing a day's work. And the other thing, too, is they always forget the tagline at the end of this, where he said, "Come follow me." Jesus was calling this young man into full-time ministry. Now, anyone who has ever read through the Bible, even casually one time, knows that we're supposed to be about the business of helping people, especially the ones that are the least fortunate in society. But at some point, we all have to face the basic human struggle. Am I responsible to take care of someone who is just too lazy to work? And the answer is no. I want to switch gears here a bit. I want to impose the question, did Jesus ever start a soup line? He not only didn't start a soup line, he actually shut one down. In John chapter 6, he gives 5,000 people a free meal. You know, the boy with the 5 barley loaves and the 2 fish? Well, he blessed it, he supernaturally multiplied it, but here's what happened the next day. Jesus says to them, "You are looking for me not because you saw the signs that I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." He said, "You're still following me because I gave you a free meal ticket." How predictable, right? The story continues, and it says, "From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. At which point, Jesus looks at the 12 disciples and says, 'Do you want to leave me too?'" He kind of pulls out this crowd thinning sermon and sends most of them back home. "Sorry, boys, the soup line is officially closed." Now, John goes on to say that after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is a prophet who's come into the world." But listen to this next statement, okay? Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him a king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Now, why would they intend to make him a king by force? Well, I think it's called free food and free medical care. Okay, let's put this guy in charge of the whole country. Now, this is a powerful lesson in politics. If you want to get elected to the throne as the new reigning king of wherever or whoever or whatever, all you have to do is promise people free stuff, and trust me, folks, you will get a vote. Now, did the Apostle Paul have anything to say about this whole dilemma of, people who are too lazy to work? Is there a balance between human compassion on my part and human responsibility on their part? Well, when you read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Paul spends a lot of time on what we call apocalyptic issues, meaning the day of the Lord, the Lord's return, things like this. Now, there were people in the church back then that were so convinced that Jesus was coming back in the first century or in their lifetime, some of them walked away from everything they had, went up and sat in the hills and just waited for Jesus to come back. Paul says, bad theology, boys. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, Paul starts by rebuking them for being idle and for mooching off of anyone who had a job. And he tells them that when he was with them, he says he worked night and day and never ate anybody's food unless he paid for it first, okay? And then he hits them with this. This is probably the one verse in the Bible that really spells it out as clearly as anything. 2 Thessalonians 3:10, for even when we were with you, we gave you this rule. If a man will not work, neither shall he eat. Now you notice Paul does not say if a man cannot work. He says if a man will not work. Now that is the breaking point for me on this issue. And the Bible tells us right there that if a man refuses to work and support himself, we are under no obligation to take care of him. He continues on here in verse 11, and he says, we hear that some of you are idle. They are not busy, but they are busybodies. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the bread they eat. Wow, settle down and earn the bread they eat. What a noble thought. Solomon tells us in Proverbs chapter 10 that a disgraceful son sleeps during the harvest. Did you know that God calls laziness a disgrace? Yeah, earn the bread you eat. So, what is the balance between human compassion and individual responsibility? Well, I think it's all about the effort you see in this person's life. You need to tell them that the depth of our compassion will be determined by the intensity of your effort. No effort, no help. Paul weighs in on this again in Ephesians chapter 4, where he says, and I quote, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with their own hands, that they might have something to share with those in need. Now, do you see what Paul is doing in that text? He's trying to move these people from a position of taking to a position of giving. He's trying to move them from someone who would steal to someone who would be a supply chain. He's trying to move them from someone who would have nothing to being someone who would have something to share with the poor. That's a huge step, isn't it? I want to give you one qualifying point here, too. If I ever got a debilitating disease or a life-altering injury, I would have a disability and would have no problem with that. That's what it's created for. But it's not for being lazy. The story gets better. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his own relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith, and he is worse than an infidel. Now, who's responsible is it to provide for your family? Okay? It's not the taxpayer. It's the man that was responsible for bringing these children into the world. I've heard it well said that there's two kinds of people in society. There are parasites and there are producers. God tells us that if we want to lead our families in a godly fashion, we need to be producers and not parasites. I have known too many big, strong men who are scamming the system, collecting a disability check and spending their whole day, fixing up yards and mowing lawns and doing whatever and making cash money on the side. That's an absolute disgrace. Who told you that society owes you a free ride? The Bible says, earn the bread that you eat. That is biblical. And again, I am not against welfare, but I am against welfare that expects nothing out of a person who appears to be very content to live off of another man's sweat. Now, we're going to switch gears here again. You've heard the name Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot and the principle of phony compassion. Now, this is what you got to watch out for in politics right here. In John chapter 12, Martha anoints the feet of Jesus with a very expensive jar of perfume. And in true fashion, Judas throws a fit and says, hey, this could have been sold for a year's wages and the money given to the poor. Sounds logical, doesn't it? Well, then John adds his own personal commentary because he knew what was going on inside of Judas's heart. And I quote, Judas did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and as a keeper of the money purse, he used to help himself to whatever was in it. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the principle of phony compassion. You see, Judas did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and as a keeper of the money purse, he used to help himself to what was ever in it. You know, this whole issue of socialism, these people, they always want to control the money purse so they can help themselves to whatever is in it, and then they give a little something to the poor to make it look like they really care. But have you ever noticed that they always steal it first before they divvy it out? Don't be fooled by the lie that we're only doing this because we care. You see, phony compassion just promotes self-empowerment because the real motivation for what these people do is to buy your vote. You know, if the Socialist Party ever needed a poster boy for phony compassion, Judas Iscariot would be your man.